When I was at secondary school, St. McCartan's College in Monaghan, the true centre of the universe, our English teacher, Mr. Lee, would sometimes read out my essays to the class as an example of how to use your imagination and be different. He was trying to make the point that in a state exam, the poor examiner would be reading hundreds of essays and would be ready to stab someone with his red pen after the third one if they were all written in the same style, and invariably, they were all written in the same style. If your essay was funny or different, you stood a very good chance of getting extra marks just out of relieving his boredom. He hastened to add that this use of humour and imagination only applied to the essay question, remembering my recent exam answer on procrastination in Hamlet, discuss, which I wrote 3 pages on without having the first clue what procrastination actually meant, but was sure it was something to do with Danish ingenuity and argued quite persuasively, I thought, that it had led directly to the eventual invention of Lego. I got an F. After I left school, I don't recall writing anything at all for either my own or anyone else's amusement until about 10 years ago when I started writing a weekly blog for the 4th largest workwear store in Monaghan. After the 3rd week, it stopped mentioning workwear or anything work-related and simply dealt with random things that occurred to me, a potted history of Monaghan, and various events that appealed to me. Music featured regularly, either concerts that I'd attended, a random fact about an album cover, or a rather convincing tale involving a visiting artist and Monaghan. I wrote about the time George Harrison had got lost as a young boy in Dublin and met Patrick Kavanagh, who inspired him to write something. I wrote about how the tradition of the Christmas tree sprung from a gift from Lord Rossmore in Monaghan to a homesick Prince Albert. I wrote about the time my granda took Johnny Cash to McKenna's bar. I wrote about the real Sergeant Pepper McGuinness, who came from Clontibret in Monaghan and served in India, sponsored schools and books in both places, and how Paul McCartney's grandfather had told him this story as he had learned to read using the books Sergeant Pepper had sponsored in the National School in Clontibret. And most wonderfully of all, I'd written about the time I'd fallen asleep on the bus to Galway, listening to a mixtape on my Walkman, and woke up to find a strange English chap sitting beside me, critiquing the tape listing with a red pen. I called it Bowie on the Bus. All of those stories were thoroughly well researched. All of the timelines and events were entirely plausible. It's just that you wouldn't have found an actual record of them anywhere else. Lots of people enjoyed them. Some people ignored my introduction of each one as a tale and considered them gospel. Monaghan people abroad took particular delight in informing everyone that the Christmas tree originated in Monaghan, and I took delight in their delight. But then I was asked for permission to publish my Sergeant Pepper story on a Beatles fan website in Liverpool, and I had to tell them that it was just that, a story. They were bitterly disappointed. Shortly afterwards, a local historian also wanted to include my Johnny Cash story in an anthology of local history, and he was absolutely disgusted with me when I told him that although it was entirely likely that if my granda had met Johnny Cash, that they would indeed have ended up in McKenna's bar, and I like to think that they had. Neither granda nor Johnny Cash had ever mentioned it. So I decided from then on, I would only write true stories in my weekly blog, or at the very, very least, mostly true stories. And I did, more or less. 6 years ago, I took my son Jake to see an up-and-coming band, The Stripes, playing upstairs in McKenna's bar on Dublin Street in Monaghan. The Stripes were a 4-piece outfit from Cavan who were getting a lot of press and had been signed up by Elton John's record label and featured in a Channel 4 documentary. They were brilliant. They'd played venues all over the UK and Japan, and even played at a private bash for the Rolling Stones. And now here they were playing upstairs in McKenna's bar on Park Street in Monaghan. Attending gigs, the standard format of any venue is that you're either in some sort of raised tier looking down on the band, or at least all on the same level looking up at the band. Not in McKenna's. 1/3 of the room is 2 steps higher than the rest, with a lovely little wooden railing on either side of a gap to see the band. The band play towards the back of the raised part, and this works fine if everyone is reserved and seated. Again, not in McKenna's. When we went upstairs, the lower part was packed with young kids who'd obviously never been to McKenna's before. The upper tier was empty, except for the band's equipment, which was set up and ready at the back. We marched up the 2 steps and took up position with our backs to the little railing. Just as the band came out to play, to a roof-lifting roar of anticipation, I got a poke in the back. "You're very rude," someone was shouting at me. "Pardon," I said, turning round to see an irate young girl. "You're very rude," she roared. "I've been here for 2 hours to get a good spot, and you just waltz in at the last minute." The face was flying off her. "Why don't you come up?" "Can I?" she said, smiling now. "Yes, of course," I said over the roar of Pete O'Hanlon's jackhammer bass playing. "I thought it was reserved for family. Are you family?" "No." "What?" I was now missing the band's first song, roaring pleasantries and explanations to this young lady. "I'm Pete's uncle," I lied. "If anyone says anything to you, just say I said it was okay." "Can my friends come up with me?" "Yes." 25 girls immediately mobbed the upper area. They had a ball. The band were brilliant, and when it was over, they all came back out and signed autographs and posed for photos. My son and I both had our photos taken with the band, and that was that. I wrote about it in my blog and thought no more about it. A few months later, I was involved in organising a business seminar in Monaghan for secondary school students. At an early planning meeting, someone suggested that we get the Stripes to play at it. "Could you ask them, Paul?" a lady asked. "Why me?" "I thought you were related to one of them." "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." "How weird. I'm sure someone said they'd read somewhere that you get to all their gigs for free because you're an uncle of one of them." I thought no more about that either. Another year later, the Stripes were playing some small rehearsal gigs and ended up back in McKenna's. This time, Jake and I were joined by my daughter Robin for her first gig. The band were even better this time. The place was even more crowded, and we again had the best spot. When the gig was over, the lads all came back out for photos and autographs. Robin got a photo with each of them in turn. When it came to getting a photo with Pete O'Hanlon, Jake had an album with him and that he wanted signed, and we got chatting to Pete for a few minutes. We mentioned that we'd seen them play in the Olympia in Dublin and here a couple of years previously. I mentioned about the young girl and the confusion over being his uncle. "Are you the big bollocks that writes the blogs?" he said. Jake and Robin laughed. "Yes," I replied. "My mum gave out to me about telling random people in Monaghan that I was related to them. She said that a friend of hers had told her she'd read about it in the newspaper." Fame at last. My stories had made it the whole way to Cavan.
Paul, that's so brilliant. Are those blogs still available somewhere?
Yeah, yes, I have. Yes, it's Bricks, Brix, Bricks Workwear, and the more recent ones are on the superjetrobotdinosaurs.com.